Hi, namaste and good morning to all. I'm Surangshu and I have planned many videos on constitutional development, and as of now this is going to be my first video. To begin with, this video is targeted to college students as well as university going students for advanced learning under the UGC NET guidelines. The topic is constitutional development in Brazil, a comprehensive historical journey. uh, I'm just giving a brief introduction. Brazil's constitutional evolution is an intricate tapestry of its political, social, and economic transformations. Each constitutional milestone reflects a struggle for democracy, federalism, and social justice, while contending with the legacies of the colonialism, military rule, and elite domination. This historical overview will delve into the key phases of Brazil's constitutional development, analyzing the impact on governance, civil rights, and state structures. Brazil's constitutional journey can be broadly divided into the following periods. First is the colonial and imperial periods, which is from 1500 to 1889. The first republic and the 1930 revolution, that is from 1889 to 1930. The Estado Novo and the military era, that is from 1937 to 1985. And the new republic and the 1988 constitution. Through these time phases, we will discuss and analyze uh, uh, how constitutional frameworks have adapted to Brazil's evolving socio-political realities. So, first is the colonial and imperial rule, that is from 1500 to 1889. The first, so to begin with, Portuguese colonial rule, that is from 1500 to 1822. The Portuguese colonization of Brazil began in 1500, and for over around 300 years, Brazil's legal framework was largely determined by the Portuguese crown. Unlike the Spanish colonies in South America, Brazil did not have autonomous local governance institutions during the colonial era. The centralization of the power in the Portuguese monarchy meant that all major decisions, including the land distribution and the legal regulations, were controlled from Lisbon. While colonial governors administered local affairs, the legal and political framework imposed by Portugal was designed to extract resources and maintain control over the vast Brazilian territory. The colonial period lacked any formal constitution specific to Brazil, reflecting its status as a dependent territory. Laws like the Ordenança Filipina regulated colonial governance, but they were general Portuguese laws applied to all colonies. Now, the independence of the Brazil and the Constitution of 1824. Brazil declared independence in 1822 with Dom Pedro I, the son of the Portuguese king, assuming the role of emperor. Unlike the violent revolution that shaped other Latin American countries, Brazil's transition to independence was relatively peaceful, but it did not result in immediate democratic transformation. The Constitution of 1824, Brazil's first formal constitution, marked a significant turning point. Modeled after the French and US constitutions, it introduced a constitutional monarchy that attempted to blend the European monarchy with a parliamentary system. Notably, it established first the bicameral legislature, that is composed of a chamber of deputies and a senate. The constitution provided parliamentary system, although the emperor retained significant power. Second, moderating power. One of the most important or unique features was the Porter moderator, that is moderating power, which gave the emperor extensive authority over legislative and judicial decisions. These mechanisms reinforced the emperor's dominance and was often used to override the autonomy of the provinces. Third is the limited suffrage. Voting was restricted by property qualifications, meaning only those rich people, the landowners, could participate in the political process. The franchise was exclusionary, leaving the majority of the population, especially the enslaved Africans and the indigenous people, outside the political sphere. Brazil under this constitution was far from a democracy. Understand, the landed aristocracy held sway over politics and slavery remained entrenched. So by 1888, just 1 year before the monarchy's fall, Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. The constitution of the 1824 remained in the place throughout the empire, reflecting the tensions between modernity and the preservation of the aristocratic privileges. Now, the First Republic and the 1930 Revolution, that is from 1889 to 1930, and with that, the Proclamation of the Republic, 1889, and the Constitution of 1891. In 1889, a military coup deposed the Emperor Dom Pedro II, marking the end of the Brazilian monarchy and the beginning of the First Republic. The coup was partly motivated by discontent among the military and land-owning elites who sought a more decentralized republican form of governance. So the Constitution of 1891, modeled heavily on the US Constitution, established Brazil as a federal republic with first the presidential system. Here, the president was to be elected through direct elections with a separation of powers among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Second is the federalism. The constitution divided the country into autonomous states, granting them considerable independence in local affairs. This decentralization was partly a reaction against the centralized monarchy. Third is the civil rights. The constitution formally granted civil rights and liberties, including freedom of speech and assembly. However, these rights were often undermined by oligarchy control and electoral fraud. Next is the First Republic was dominated by an oligarchic system known as cafe-com-like politics, which is basically a reference to the dominance of the coffee-growing elites from Sao Paulo and the dairy-producing elites from Minas Gerais. Despite the progressive ideas of the Constitution of 1891, political power remained in the hands of the rural elites and electoral corruption was rampant. The federal structure, while designed to promote decentralization, resulted in regional oligarchies exercising significant power and at the expense of national unity. Furthermore, the military remained a powerful political force, often intervening in civilian politics, a pattern that would resurface throughout Brazilian's history. Now, the 1930 revolution and the constitution of 1934. By the late 1920s, Brazil was facing deep social and economic tensions driven by the global economic depression and dissatisfaction with the oligarchic rule. In 1930, Getúlio Vargas led a revolution that overthrew the First Republic and established a provincial government. The same we can see in Bangladesh, and provincial like that. Vargas, who would dominate Brazilian politics for the next 15 years, oversaw the drafting of the Constitution of 1934. This document reflected the socio-political changes of the time, incorporating progressive reforms aimed at labor rights and social welfare. Key provisions of the 1934 Constitution, including labor rights. For the first time, the Constitution recognized labor rights such as a minimum wage, social security, and the right to strike. It also established labor courts to resolve disputes between workers and employers. Next is the electoral reform. Please try to understand this one. The creation of the electoral court aimed to reduce the electoral fraud that had plagued previous elections, and women were also granted the right to vote for the first time in Brazilian history. The third is the corporatism. Inspired by European corporatist models, the constitution allowed for the creation of state-controlled unions and professional associations, integrating labor and capital under the state's supervision. Despite these reforms, Vargas dissolved the constitution in 1937, just 4 years, establishing an authoritarian regime also known as the Estado Novo. Now, the Estado Novo and the military era, that is from 1937 to 1985. The Estado Novo 1937 to 1945 and the authoritarian constitution of 1937. The Estado Novo regime, established by the Gutulo Vargas in 1937, marked a shift towards authoritarianism. Vargas, who had initially portrayed himself as a reformer, suspended the 1934 constitution and replaced it with the constitution of 1934, which established a highly centralized and corporatist state. So the constitution of 1937, what it did is abolished political parties. That is, the new constitution banned all political parties, consolidating power in the hands of the Vargas and its supporters. Next was the censorship and repression. Vargas justified the authoritarian turn as necessary to defend Brazil from the global threats of the communism and fascism. Censorship of the press, the arrest of political dissidents, and the suppression of the opposition became common practices under this regime. Next, corporatism and labor control. While the Estado Novo continued to promote state-led economic modernization and industrialization, it imposed strict controls on labor unions and workers' organizations, subordinating them to the state. Now, the Estado Novo lasted until 1945, while Vargas was forced to resign under the pressure from the military and growing demands for democratization. Now, next comes the Constitution of 1946 and coming back, returning to democracy. So, the fall of the Estado Novo regime led to the adoption of the Constitution of 1946, which restored democratic governance. This constitution was marked by reinstatement of civil liberty, that is, the constitution re-established the rights of free speech, assembly, and political participation. Next is federalism and decentralization. While maintaining a strong executive, the 1946 constitution granted significant autonomy to the states, reflecting Brazil's federal structure. Next, third is expansion of voting rights. Suffrage was extended to all the illiterate citizens, although illiteracy remained a significant barrier to the participation for large sections of the population. Now comes the Constitution of 1946, which ushered in a period of democratic governance, but Brazil's democracy remained somewhat fragile. The country experienced political instability with rapid turnover in governments, economic difficulties, and growing tensions between the military and the civilian political leaders. Now, coming to the military dictatorship and the Constitution of 1967, which is basically from 1964 to 1985. In 1964, amid economic instability and fears of a leftist revolution, the Brazilian military staged a coup, overthrowing President Raul Goulart and establishing a military dictatorship that would last for over 2 decades. The regime enacted the Constitution of 1967, which, while maintaining the outward appearance of a democratic system, concentrated significant power in the hands of the military and executive branch. Now, key features of the Constitution of 1967 is first is the expansion of executive powers. That is, the president was granted extraordinary powers, including the authority to rule by decree and dismiss Congress under certain conditions. This marked a substantial departure from democratic norms, as the executive branch gained near total control over the legislative and judicial processes. Next was the restrictions on political rights. The military regime curtailed basic civil liberties, including the freedom of speech, press, and assembly. Political parties were severely limited, with only two parties permitted: the pro-regime National Renewal Alliance Party and the opposition Brazilian Democratic Movement (MDB). These restrictions fostered a climate of political repression, silencing dissent and curtailing the activities of leftist and progressive groups. Now, third is the institutional acts. The most infamous of this was the Institutional Act number 5, passed in 1968, which effectively suspended the Constitution's protections of civil liberties. The Article 5 gave the government authority to close Congress, censor the media, and arrest political opponents without due process. These acts symbolized the height of the military's authoritarian grip over the country and lasted until 1978, when it was repealed as part of a gradual liberalization. The military justified these actions as necessary for maintaining national security and defending the nation, according to them, against the perceived threat of communism during the Cold War. This period was marked by widespread human rights violations, including arbitrary arrest, torture, and the forced disappearance of political dissidents. While the dictatorship promoted economic modernization, especially through infrastructure projects and industrialization, these benefits were unevenly distributed. The Brazilian miracle of rapid economic growth in the 1970s eventually gave way to severe economic crisis in the early 1980s, compounded by high inflation and rising inequality. Now, the transition to democracy and the Constitution of 1988. The early 1980s saw growing dissatisfaction with military rule as economic crisis and popular movements, including labor strikes and student protests, intensified. Amid mounting pressure for democratization, the military began a process of political liberalization that is leading to direct elections for state governance in and eventually the election of a civilian president, Tancredo Neves. In 1985, Neves' election marked the formal end of the military rule, though the tragically died before taking office, and his vice president Jose Sarne assumed the presidency. The culmination of this transition was the drafting of this Constitution of 1988, known as the Citizens Constitution, which marked the re-establishment of democracy and the beginning of the new republic. This constitution remains in effect today as one of the most progressive legal frameworks in Brazil's history. Now, the key features of the constitution of 1988. First is the democratic and participatory framework. That is, the constitution of 1988 explicitly commits Brazil to a democratic, participatory, and pluralistic political system. So it basically restores and strengthens civil liberties, guarantees freedom of expression, association, and assembly, and ensures universal suffrage. So voting is compulsory for all literate citizens and over the age of 18, and optional for those aged 16 to 18 and over 70. Next, federalism and decentralization. The constitution reaffirms Brazil's federal system, granting considerable autonomy of states and municipalities. This decentralization was intended to balance power between the central government and the regions, promoting a more equitable distributions of resources and encouraging local governance. Next was the separation of powers. The constitution established a clear separation of powers among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Checks and balances were designed to prevent the concentration of power in any one branch, a response to authoritarianism of military regime. Next is the social rights and protections. A defining characteristic of the 1988 Constitution is its emphasis on social rights. It guarantees a wide range of economic, social, and cultural rights, including universal access to healthcare through the Sistema Único de Saúde or SUS, education, and social security. The Constitution also enshrines labor rights such as right to strike, paid vacations, and unemployment benefits, marking a major step forward in the protection of workers. Next was the human rights and the civil liberties. The Constitution of 1988 codifies a robust commitment to human rights, including protections against torture, arbitrary imprisonment, and capital punishment. It also establishes mechanisms for protecting human rights through the public ministry, an independent body tasked with defending the public interest and ensuring the enforcement of laws. Next comes the judicial review and oversight. The judiciary plays a crucial role in interpreting the constitution, with the Supreme Federal Court holding the power of judicial review. This allows the court to strike down laws and execute actions that violate constitutional provisions. Additionally, the constitution introduced the concept of diffuse control, allowing ordinary courts to rule on the constitutionality of laws in individual cases. And lastly, environmental protection. Recognizing Brazil's vast natural resources, particularly the Amazon rainforest, the 1988 Constitution includes several provisions dedicated to environmental conservation and sustainable development. It obligates the government to preserve the environment for future generations, promoting responsible use of natural resource. Now, political and economic challenges, which is in the contemporary time, the post 1988. While the Constitution of 1988 laid the foundation for democratic governance and civil liberties, Brazil's political system faced significant challenges in ensuing decades. The impeachment of the President Fernando Collor de Mello in 1992 for corruption exposed the deep-rooted issues of political corruption and governance failures. The political and economic crisis continued into the 21st century, most notably with the Operation Car Wash in investigations which uncovered widespread corruptions involving top politicians and business elites. The investigations led to the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff in recently 2016 and contributed to the political polarization that continues to shape Brazil's political landscape even today. Despite these challenges, the Constitution of 1988 has proved resilient, guiding Brazil through political turbulence and serving a framework for democratic governance. This country has held a regular, free and fair elections, and political pluralism has been maintained even amid intense polarization. Now, the role of constitutional courts and judicial activism. Uh, an important aspect of Brazil's modern constitutional development is the increasing role of the judiciary, particularly the Supreme Federal Court, in shaping political and social policies. The STF has exercised judicial activism, intervening in key issues such as electoral disputes, corruption, investigations, and the protection of minority rights. The rise of judicial activism has sparked debates on the limits of judicial power. Critics argue that the courts, particularly the STF, have overstepped their role, acting as a super legislature in areas traditionally reserved for the elected branches. However, supporters contend that the judiciary plays a critical role in upholding the constitution, especially in a political environment often marked by corruption and inefficiency. Now, contemporary constitutional debates and reforms. In recent years, several proposals for constitutional reform have emerged, driven by concerns over the effectiveness of Brazil's political system. This includes debates over political representation, such as the role of campaign financing and the need for electoral reform to reduce corruption and improve accountability. Other discussions focus on the balance of powers between the executive and legislative branches, particularly in context of Brazil's coalition presidentialism, where the president must form a coalition government to secure a majority in the Congress. Moreover, Brazil's complex federal system, while offering local autonomy, has faced criticism for inefficiencies in governance and public service delivery, prompting discussions on reforms to improve state capacity and accountability. Now, to conclude, the constitutional development of Brazil is a dynamic reflection of the country's political, social, and economic challenges. from its early days as a Portuguese colony, through periods of monarchy, republic, dictatorship, and democracy, each constitution has responded to the what to say unique demands of its time. The Constitution of 1988 represents the most comprehensive attempt to establish a democratic, inclusive, and socially just political order. However, Brazil's democratic experiment remains a work in progress. The country continues to grapple with issues of corruption, inequality, and political instability, all of which pose challenges, to the full realization of its constitutional ideas. As Brazil moves forward, the resilience of its constitution and the commitment of its institutions to uphold democratic values will be critical in shaping the future. So that's it, the end. So if you like this video, do like, comment, and share. And if you think there's a need to change something or any information to add, please comment down below. And my special thanks to Associate Professor Dilip sir and Dr. Annapurna from Midnapur College Autonomous for guiding me and helping me completing this video. I thank to all, and if anyone wants the reference, I can provide them. You can just simply mail it me. Okay. Thank you.